This is House Planning Help, episode 346. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in building a new home or retrofitting an existing property. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Andy Marlow from Envirotecture, and we're going to be chatting about the uptake of Passivhaus in Australia. And also, there's a big difference compared to the UK that it's more about cooling than heating, for obvious reasons. We'll talk generally, though, about the architectural process and get tips, as we always like to do. He's a lovely guy as well. I must thank architect Ruth Butler for helping set up this one, because I noticed on social media, hold on, she's out in Sydney, and I knew I was heading that way too. So I asked for a recommendation and she said, you've got to speak to Andy. He is your man. And what's funny is that Ruth obviously just got whatever work she could when she arrived out there. But by the time I'd got there, she was, of course, working for Envirotecture, and I think she'll be perfectly at home there. I do love Australia from the variety that they've got. I suppose that comes with having such a big country, so many different climates, such delicious fruit and veg. Don't know whether that's just arriving in the summer or whether it's always like that, but that really hit me as the very first thing that I noticed. But my brother has lived out there for 30 years plus now, and I've got a strong reason to keep going back. Of course I have, but I've started to feel the responsibility of traveling to the other side of the world. So I think that that's going to be my last trip. And I wanted to talk more about that after today's interview. So the last time I was in Sydney, it was a decade ago. I recorded a couple of interviews. We'll link those, of course, one with Claire Parry and one with Michael Mobbs. However, I don't think I realised that there were no certified Passivhaus projects in Sydney at that time. In fact, Envirotecture delivered that first project in Sydney, and that's where we start our conversation. I asked Andy what the uptake of Passivhaus was like today.
It has grown exponentially, which is a nice way to say there was stuff all and now there's a few. The first one in Sydney was in 2018. And that was one that we did. And since then, there's been quite a few more. And it's growing at a very rapid rate.
And why?
Predominantly because people have realised that it's a way to deliver on health, comfort and efficiency. And it's the health and comfort parts, in our view, that are the ones that are driving it.
So when we say that, how would you describe most Australian buildings and how they're put together?
Tense. Often wooden, sometimes made from masonry. But basically, it's like living outdoors, except less good. The people seeking Passivhaus have been mostly people who've lived overseas. They're not necessarily from overseas. There might be Australians who've lived in other countries, but they've experienced what good housing can be like, and they've come home and gone, I want one of those. I can't believe I lived in this stuff before.
What about the classic line, I live an indoor-outdoor lifestyle? And I can't remember who I spoke to, but once upon a time, there was an argument that was put to me that actually taking out all the insulation in certain climates would be more sustainable.
There are a couple of places where that would make sense. An island somewhere in the Whitsundays, far north Queensland, possibly. But in everywhere else, no. The indoor-outdoor lifestyle is certainly seen as a thing and sold as a thing, and the real estate agents love it, and people love it when it occurs. The issue is that when you look at climate data and people's lives and how they actually live, it's an incredibly small portion of the year. And as soon as you take a building physics approach to things and say, well, how will I stay warm? How will I stay cool? More importantly, then all of a sudden you follow some rabbit holes and end up concluding that you need to build something that looks remarkably like a certified Passivhaus.
So when you say that cooling, is it equivalent to what we would have for heating? How is it analysed?
So we do a lot of certified Passivhaus buildings, and we do all our analysis through the Passivhaus planning package. And it's the same principles. It's all just in reverse, really. The tricky part is that it's easier to keep a building warm because you've obviously got an amount of internal loads, and you can just put more insulation, wrap it up more and more insulation, and hold on to the heat that you've got. Coolth is different because you're not generating it naturally, and therefore wrapping your building up doesn't always help very much. and therefore keeping buildings cool is actually a much bigger design challenge than keeping them warm.
So how do you keep them cool? Is there a logical approach? I know some of it is still important in climates where actually we have the extremes. We have it very cold in the winter and very hot in the summer.
The underpinning principles are fairly straightforward, and they're all rooted in passive solar design. So really it's around shading and window sizes, placement, etc., etc. Australian vernacular architecture, to the extent that we have a vernacular, is often around big eaves shading windows. That is a very good place to start. The biggest practical issue that we face as architects and designers in Australia is the expectation around the size of glass, size of windows, size of doors, and a lot of it comes back to that indoor-outdoor lifestyle and people's desires, expectations and beliefs around that. Basically, you hit a point where it doesn't matter how good the glass is, doesn't matter how good your eaves are, then you start needing to use external blinds, like things that are directly adjacent to the window to keep the sun off them, and you also just hit a point where regardless there's just too much glass and you just need to control the amount of glass in the buildings.
Is that an easy sell given that your main clients understand what they're trying to build?
Our clients are fairly unique. So our company is called Envirotecture, which obviously is a blend of two words, and anyone who looks at us on the internet will have a good sense of what we do. So we attract a certain type of client to begin with, so we're sort of, that makes things easier. It still can be a bit of a battle. People's desire to look at views through very large sheets of glass seems to be baked in human nature, and yeah, it's not always as easy as we'd like it to be. But you know, we use the tools we have to make the arguments and use the numbers and try to use the reality and the lived experience of others.
And what about some of the examples then? Is that useful for selling the concepts as well? Maybe we can include a couple of images in the show notes. So yeah, can you outline a project that you've done that you think would be good to mention?
The very first one that we finished in certified Passivhaus, we finished in Sydney actually, which is a place called Thornleigh, so it's middle suburban Sydney. It's got a massive 5 metre wide north facing window in it. Interestingly, it's got no eaves on it, which was a deliberate choice. It wasn't a mistake, but it's got one of the external blinds on it. And we did it for a whole host of reasons, and it was to get as much solar gain in as we could in winter, and it's due to the nature of the block of the land and that sort of stuff. So the blinds give us real control. They come at a price, obviously, but everything in building comes at a price. And the other thing, which in this case we had no qualms about at all, is also they require the occupants to use them. So there's no point having a blind if someone doesn't press the button for it to come down. So these clients are incredibly sort of active in their management of the house. So it works like a charm.
Yeah, I'm very active in my own passive house and trying to keep it as cool as I can. But a lot of it is baked into the design, which I'm a big fan of. So your experience of blinds, are they reliable? Do they do the job as you say? Are they intuitive to the user?
Yes, the blinds definitely do their job. The are they intuitive to the user part depends on the user. Every one of the certified passive houses that we've done that's done in the country, I'm pretty sure, they all have mechanical cooling. It's very, very common here. 86% of new houses in Australia have mechanical cooling. It's just what happens. It's also used for heating. So in the whole heat pumpification, electrification debate, Australia, to some degree, while we're way behind in other parts, is quite ahead in that because it's just the cheapest way to heat and cool a house. So therefore, that part of carbon management is well under control. As to how people use the blinds, most of our clients get told, and we have enough discussions on the way through that they understand how to operate the building when they get there. We give them a manual that explains how to do these things and why it should work and how it should work. At mass scale, I guess the concern is always going to be that a new occupant of a house may not be aware that these things exist and work, and I think handover manuals and that sort of stuff is the best you can hope for.
Yeah, I've seen one situation where a brise soleil was ripped out because they thought it was ugly, and there was a lot of glass under there. Let's outline this cooling process, because I really haven't seen it that much in the UK. We have a couple of reverse cycle heat pumps, but I'm not sure how effective it is. So can you just give us a good rundown? Where do we start with cooling, and what does it mean in terms of infrastructure?
Okay, so in terms of where to start, it's with the passive solar design. So keep the heat out of the building as much as you can. So Eaves, things that don't require human intervention, so eaves are good for that as the first port of call. Then you go to the blinds, so press a button, they come down, that sort of thing. And then you're into the what systems do I use. The other part is obviously the ability to open windows and have cross ventilation as well. So that's like natural cooling, which is what we've always used in passive solar design. That works pretty well most of the time. You need to be able to open the windows enough. You can have security concerns and privacy concerns, and obviously falling out of window concerns if you're 4 stories up and you've got a small child. All of those things will help to get you to a place where you need no or less mechanical cooling, at which point then you're into air conditioning. We tend to use what we refer to as split systems. So tends to be a wall-mounted unit that sits on there's an indoor unit that sits on the wall. There's an outdoor compressor, the heat pump part, which is obviously making the coolth and kicking the heat out into the outside world. They're really effective. They're much easier to control than a full ducted system. Ducted systems are quite common in poorly performing homes, and it's because you can have an outlet into every single space. What we find in passive homes is that because of the overall performance of the building shell, your fluctuations in temperature are much slower, and therefore if you can dump coolth into a couple of strategic places in a home, generally a 1 unit upstairs, 1 unit downstairs if it's a 2-story house, that it will do a good enough job of keeping the rest of the building cool enough, and therefore you can manage it that way, and you've got this much better level of control. As soon as you go into a full ducted system, there's a cost from an installation point of view, but there's also a sort of a bluntness to the tool, and in the Australian context at least, the installation quality of ducted air conditioning systems is fairly woeful. So they tend to operate very inefficiently, not because the gear is inefficient, but because the installation is inefficient, and it's to do with the ducts and how the ducts are installed, because they're big and there's never enough space in the building to run them properly, so they try to turn like 135 degree corners, which ducts don't like to do. Hence, split systems are reliable.
And what are you setting in temperature? Is it the same as a passive house would be in other countries, or slightly higher because of the outdoor temperature?
In the modelling sense, we're still using the 20 to 25 degree range because it's passive house and that's the certification barriers, or hurdles, whatever you want to call them. We'll often stress test to see the difference it makes if we nudge that number up to, say, 26 degrees and see how much difference it makes on cooling, which mostly then is coming down to money and energy use. In reality, when we talk to clients and look at the data, because we often data log the houses afterwards, some are warmer and some are cooler. And therefore, as with all houses in particular, it comes down to the humans inside. And they're going to run it at the temperature that they want, almost regardless of all the other things. So part of the design process is to try to work out where they sit, to try to get the building to get them as close to that benchmark as we can without the need for that cooling device.
And what is it outside the building? How is the temperature fluctuating? What are your extremes?
We are a broad, massive country, as you well know. It's huge. It is not uncommon to go over 40 degrees in most parts of the country, and some of them a lot more than others. So we're currently sitting within a couple of k's of the coast, and therefore it'll go down to maybe 5 degrees as a cold overnight temperature pretty occasionally, not much, but we'll still hit over 40 here. And then we go to places up in the mountains where it quite easily get to -5, -10.
What about the investment side then? Do they look at the numbers and go, no way we can afford this? Or, how are you making it affordable? You're achieving passive house, you're getting this great indoor environment.
It's the hardest part of everything we do, without a shadow of a doubt. We joke that 5% of our job is design and the other 95% is making stuff happen. It's mostly successfully sold when people comprehend the benefits, and the benefits have nothing to do with the money. It's mostly around the health and the comfort, and that's partly because of the quality of everything else that exists in terms of, if I don't do this, what will I end up with? And the answer to that is normally too hot, too cold, too mouldy. And therefore, if you don't want that, you end up in this long discussion, which again, you follow building physics and logic and suddenly go, oh, look, I need to build something that looks remarkably like a passive house. So that's sort of how that circular conversation goes. The money part's incredibly difficult. Australia has so in terms of new houses, we build the largest houses in the world at an average of 244 square metres, which is about 3 times the UK average, I believe. Yet we also build per square metre the cheapest houses in the world. And that's the project homes, because they've refined how to build very big things very, very cheaply. And therefore, when you want to build something that performs, your delta between what could I build if I could get one of those big cheap project homes versus something that's high quality, the delta can be quite large. And therefore, what we've found, and what everyone in the passive house world in Australia has found, is that they're not really the people that we're currently competing against, much as we'd like to. This is about, if I'm going to do a custom built, custom design, whether you build it yourself or pay a builder, but not an off-the-shelf project home. If you're going to do that, then the conversation about money and cost becomes much more interesting, because the difference, as soon as you pay a custom builder, which is what most of our work is, when you pay them to build something, the cost to get them to build it a little bit better isn't that great. And off the cuff, we'll say the difference is the cost of a ventilation system, because we'll save on mechanical because you won't put in ducted, but you'll pay for a ventilation system a regular house doesn't have, and you'll pay for a bit more attention to detail to get your building airtight. In Sydney and north of Sydney, the insulation values in a passive house are not wildly different to a code compliant house, because the climate is beneficial. Colder places, that's not quite the case.
So is cost the main challenge that you'd face if you wanted to commission a home in Australia, or what other key challenges can you expect? For example, in the UK, land is just such a big one as well.
I'd say that it's basically the same here, in that the issue with land is mostly the cost of buying it and obtaining it, and therefore the two things tend to go hand in hand. Cost is definitely the biggest one. Most of the technical issues have been resolved, for better or worse, because we're so far behind the rest of the world. Almost everything else has already been done somewhere, and therefore nearly every problem that we've come across, we've found a solution for that mostly isn't entirely unique. It's a bit of a borrow from A, borrow from B, and here's C. So yeah, the cost is definitely the big one. When you drill into why, that's when it gets really interesting. So one of our two big challenges inside of it are the things. So Australia makes very little. We dig a lot of things up and send them to other parts of the world where they make stuff. So nearly everything that goes into a building is imported. I think on average 80-something% of the house is imported.
Is it really? That is a surprise to me. I always think of Australia as producing everything themselves.
Glass is imported. Huge amount of insulation products are imported. All of the membranes that we use are imported. No one makes mechanical ventilation systems here at all. All the ducting for that is also imported. A lot of timber is we have a timber industry, but we also import a lot of timber as well. And anything new is really, basically expensive. Wood fiberboard. Great product, love it. Seems to be what everyone uses in the UK, because you just go to B&Q or whatever it is. And
probably not. I don't know specifically. You do need some specialists for some of this stuff. Is that the same? We mention a lot on the podcast about using timber I-joists and cellulose blown in and wood fiberboard adding extra insulation, or does it not work quite so well?
In most of our climates, the depth of those timbers is more than you need. So it hasn't become a thing, because our Victorian office does a lot of work in colder places where that sort of stuff really would be quite handy. But sort of 140mm timber studs with insulation in between studs is good enough in a large chunk of the country. And therefore getting fatter doesn't really bring a huge amount of benefit. The wood fiberboard's incredibly good because of the continuous insulation on the outside of a frame. Kills all the thermal bridges, all of those things which you and your listeners would probably be aware of. So that's a good product for a whole bunch of those reasons. And we can get it. It's just expensive because it's imported to start with. Freight got expensive, and it's voluminous. It's not like an MVHR unit, doesn't take up much room in a shipping container, whereas you'd fill a container full of insulation and do a house, maybe two.
So, Andy, what would it look like then if we were coming to you as a client? Can you take us through the process at your practice here?
Sure thing. So the key part, the biggest and most important part of every project is getting a design brief sorted. Like, why are we bothering? Like, why do you want to do this? Why do anything at all? Especially if it's a retrofit. What's wrong with the house you got? Suck it up. Bit hot, bit cold. What's your problem? There's obviously a reason, and we're not trying to talk people out of things, mostly, and therefore it's setting the parameters for what are we trying to achieve. And we use that to always come back to on the way through to make sure, are we still doing what we set out to do? And if we're not, is this new thing a good step in the right direction. We don't want to go on tangents, spend a lot of money on something that people don't ultimately want. From there, we roll into a relatively, in architectural terms, standard design process, work out what the building's actually going to look like. And then we spend a lot of time quite early on, probably earlier than most, looking at how is it going to actually get built, both in terms of the detailing, the materiality of it, but also who. So whether it's an owner-builder, as we call them here, self-build in the UK, or whether it's a licensed builder, but we need to understand that from the get-go because there's differences as to how those things will happen. Professional builders have certain preferences sometimes, so if we know the actual company that's going to do it, that can be really beneficial. If it's someone who's owner building their own project, it's like, well, are you actually going to build it yourself with your own hands, or are you just going to project manage other people? And again, often requires different detailing, systems, and also documentation. We've had some owner builders who are awesome and literally, like, they've got a floor plan and they're just working it out because they're smart and they know what they're doing. And we've had other owner builders where we almost have to draw every single detail because they are inexperienced and they just need that kind of hand holding. So neither's better or worse as such, they're just very different, and understanding that from the start governs the process as to what happens.
Do they have different levels of skill coming into it? For example, they might have done either quite an in-depth renovation before, so they're prepared for it, versus not so much. Is that what the big difference is, or is it more the detail, attention to detail?
It can be all of those things. Some of our best owner builders, we've tried to talk into becoming professionals after the fact. We've just watched them do it and go, geez, you're better than some of the guys who are already doing this as a job. Some of them have some sort of related background. We've got one at the moment who's an engineer, like not a structural engineer, but he's
very common.
Yeah, he's got an engineering brain. And therefore he pulls everything apart, builds it 17 times in his head, draws it 16 times, then thinks about it again, changes his mind and does something else. So there's a level of thought in that. And it will also take him 4 to 5 years to build this house. It's also a complicated house. He's happy with that, is what he wants to do. Others are in it to try to save money, and sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. And it really, for me, I think the key difference is, do you want to do this? And anyone who's in it purely to save the money, not because they really want the experience and all of the positives that can come from it, if you're just in it for the money, I'd say it's probably not going to go very well.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good tip. What about your builders then? What is the skill level like there?
The builders that we work with, especially the ones that we work with a second time, are awesome. There's a reason we go back. We haven't had that many that we've worked with that we won't go back with, to be fair. We mostly work again and again with the builders that we also like as humans, just because there's enough challenges in our world as it is, and we like to gather a team of people that we enjoy the company of. So that isn't a problem for us, finding new builders in different places, because we work all across the country, so that can be a challenge. As a nation, we have a massive skills shortage across almost everything. We have failed to educate people in trades for many years. Everyone's focused on going to university to get degrees, which is nothing wrong with that, of course. I've got a couple myself. But we've neglected vocational training, and therefore we've got a massive dearth there, and that's led to problems at a whole bunch of levels, which includes a large number of people who have fairly well-paying jobs doing work not particularly well, but due to a lack of competition, they still have jobs. And therefore, the skills and trades at the broad level is very, very challenging, because people have not been building in a way that's, well, actually legally compliant even half the time.
Well, that's not good.
No.
What about, you mentioned going to places that you don't really know, trying to find a builder. How do you do it?
We've become fairly adept at it. We make a fair few phone calls and we ask some dumb questions. So we've kind of learnt to put on the silly hat, and you sort of lead people down a path and see what answers they throw back at you.
Go on, give me a dumb question.
You just sort of sit there and go, the client wants to build this Passivhaus thing. It's meant to be airtight. What do you know about this? It sounds a bit crazy to us. And if they... you can tell...
I understand. I think I could get past the first question.
Yeah. So we do stuff like that. That's the random people, obviously. Our default first is obviously ring architect friends, designer friends that we know, and talk to them and talk to the builders.
Recommendation.
And talk to the Australian Passivhaus Association has a list of all the certified tradespeople. You start with those. But when you run out of those options, that's where we go.
And it must be tricky as well because you want to check out work as well, and you've got a big country. How do you get there? How do you deploy people, your team?
Look, that part's not too bad. I mean, we have a big country, but also it's not unusual to get in a car, drive for 3 hours, have a meeting, and then drive home again. Now, whether that's truly sustainable is a very different question. So that part's not too bad. There's always site visits involved in all of our projects anyway. The further away they get, to be honest, the less site visits we end up with. Technology has obviously made a whole bunch of that stuff much better, or at least more economical. So there's always the site visits, the physical ones, and that's when we deal with a lot of those things. And because you travel distance, it'll be a whole day. Whereas if it was a guy around the corner, you'd rock up for 40 minutes, you're done, you go again. These things just become bigger when they occur.
In the UK, there's a lot of talk about embodied carbon, and we're trying to piece together all the things that make a difference so that, like you mentioned earlier, having houses that are too big, we're trying to get as much right as we can. So is that easier here? Is your default timber frame? And what examples do you have?
At a national scale, our conversations around embodied carbon are not as advanced as they are in the UK from the things I see in here. But within the Passivhaus world, it's a big thing because of mostly the nature of the people, and everyone cares about this stuff. The default construction for most housing full stop is timber frame. Nearly every passive house is also timber frame, so the wall and the roof part is fairly straightforward. Our mass construction industry build a lot of brick veneer houses, so they build the timber frame and then stick bricks on the outside just because it's cheap the way they do it. So there's a bit of a transition there, and floors obviously are very tricky because they tend to be a lot of concrete slabs because concrete's got a lot of good qualities apart from the carbon part. So the standard is not terrible, and we certainly don't have the issues that UK have in getting away from brick and block construction. In terms of really good pushing the envelope embodied carbon stuff, we've just finished a house in Victoria which is a straw bale house, but it's a prefab called a sit-up panel. So it is basically a timber frame which has got the straw bales in situ, and therefore it's speedy on site, etc., etc. And there's a company in Bristol that do these, actually. I met the guy years ago. And those kind of buildings are sort of pushing the envelope on that embodied carbon front. It's not a huge house. It's on a big block of land in a field in the middle of nowhere. And we still have quite a lot of those houses getting built, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But, how to do those things in a fairly compact way and in a low carbon way is really, really important. So there is some really good stuff happening around there. It's a certified passive house. It's off-grid, so it's got a fairly decent solar system. So it's premium because you can't go off-grid without getting to premium. So, it ticks basically all the boxes that we need to tick.
Yeah, we haven't talked about generation. Is that just a default as well for most houses to have PV?
Yes. The majority of new houses, full stop, end up with PV on the roof. The economics of it make sense now and have done for some considerable time, and therefore it's just happening. The key questions really are around the size of the array. So like the average size of new stuff is creeping up and getting closer to sort of 10-ish. I guess the more interesting part, especially when you start looking at passive house and performance and all of those issues, ends up being around the balance between capacity and generation on an annual basis, and then starting to look at things like peak load and the transition of the grid and all of the issues that fold into that. In that, a lot of big, inefficient houses with big air conditioners, while they might make a lot of electricity at various points if the roof is suited, in the middle of big electricity spikes, they're going to struggle, but also when the system crashes, then they're completely stuffed. So yes, PV is sort of well sorted, but a lot of cases it's sitting on top of what we call very fancy looking sheds, even though people think they live in a house.
Yes. And battery storage, is that a route that people go down, or is going into the grid easier?
Going into the grid's definitely easier. Batteries are still not the default, but they're becoming more common. Some people are doing batteries as a stuff you to the energy companies. Our feed-in tariff, that what you get back for feeding in, is at various points was very high and very generous to encourage, and now it's at the point where it's almost insulting. So a lot of people are like, stuff you. Some people are in it for a personal resilience point of view, and some people are in it for the environmental. So there's a few different reasons which drive people to batteries, but at the moment the economics of it aren't particularly compelling.
Now, a little while back, I was asking about your process of how you work through with clients. Did we get to the end of that? Can you remember where we got to?
So we're talking about builders and the fact that we spend a fair bit of time reasonably early on working out who's going to build the project. So that occurs sort of during the design development phase, which is normally before we've gone to planning, because we want to know enough about the building. Once, assume the UK is fairly similar, once you go to planning, your ability to change stuff later becomes fairly limited, and therefore you want to make sure you got it right. It upfronts a lot of the work, which can sometimes feel a bit ahead of its time, but is generally ends up being an absolute godsend. So we're getting as much locked in as early as we possibly can, including the human. And part of the strategy with professional builders, with licensed builders, is that because of the nature at the moment, there's a lot of work around for them and they're all very, very busy. It also is partly about getting them locked into the project. So they know that they're going to build your house, albeit in 9 months' time. So they've got security of work. They may not have a signed piece of paper, but everyone's mostly doing the right thing. So it's in their interests, it's in the client's interest, and it's certainly in our interests from just a sanity point of view. So we're doing that, we're going to planning, and then post-planning, we're dealing with all the detailing and construction documentation and refining interiors as well. So we spend a lot of time now getting our interiors to absolutely sing, because that's the stuff you end up looking at every day.
Yeah, it does sell. What challenges crop up during construction? Anything out of the ordinary or memorable?
Most of our new build construction goes very smoothly. Occasionally you'll have issues with stuff related to groundworks, things that you literally couldn't see before someone dug a hole. So the new build stuff we find is fairly straightforward because it's all built new, and as long as everything's done in the right sequence, all is good and well. The retrofit projects are obviously quite different, and mostly at the moment where someone takes something apart and everyone stares at a wall and goes, "Oh, we haven't seen it done that way before." So one of the things that we've learned, we've finished, I think, maybe 2 Envirotectures properly at the moment that are actually across the line, and we've got a whole bunch of others that are underway. We're now very much avoiding detailing almost anything before we start. We've got a strategy in terms of insulation values that we need to achieve and products, but we're mostly waiting until demo stage to then walk around, stare at everything, and then resolve most of the detailing. We know enough about what we think we'll do, and we've had conversations, but we're not documenting as much early now because we're just finding we've thrown away so much work and time.
You've mentioned already about how some of the houses are more like sheds. So do you come across this a lot, that you are facing up Envirotecture versus demolish and rebuild? Is that, do you find yourself drawn both ways?
Yes, it can be really challenging. The one job that's in my mind at the moment, the clients came to us convinced that they needed to knock down the house and have a new house. It's a big house on a big block of land in a fairly affluent part of Sydney. And they come to this conclusion because they'd spent money and time and energy over the years trying to make it better, and they hadn't succeeded. And they'd done some good things, but there's some other things that had been done that weren't awesome. And we spent a very long time going in circles because we'd designed a new house which geometrically looked remarkably like the existing one, because a lot of the bones were pretty good. Anyway, over almost a year, we sort of talked, designed, and negotiated, and we eventually ended up we're going to pull off an old addition that was added on that looked fine, but just wasn't working. And now it's an Envirotecture project. And this is the one where they've pulled some things apart and we've found some interesting things. So we're going next week to work out what to do about that. So it's a real dilemma quite frequently. And it's partly embodied carbon, it's partly money. And one of the challenges on this one was the client at one point did turn around and say, as long as it doesn't cost me any more to do the retrofit, I'm okay with that, which was not an unfair thing to say. The challenge is obviously for the builder to price a retrofit is much, much harder than to price a new build, which is, in their world, fairly straightforward.
Yeah, and like you mentioned before about a second go at things, a second retrofit is often priced very differently to the first retrofit.
Yes. I mean, to be fair, these builders we do know very, very well, and they have done a couple, so that we're confident that they're not too far off the mark.
Do you find that it gets under the skin of the builders? Do they not want to go back to some of the other houses that they're building, or are they flexible?
Yeah, one of the guys that we do a lot of work with, they've built a few passive houses for us now. they talk quite explicitly about some of the sustainable work that they did before we all knew each other, and just how they now realise it wasn't. And I think that that's a really good thing. I mean, one of the most interesting conversations is, your elevator pitch, what do you do? It's like, well, we run a company called Envirotecture. What does that do? It's like, well, it's kind of hard to succinctly put. Like, we used to say it was sustainable architecture. And we're like, well, what the hell does that mean? And this is the evolution. Like, what we thought was sustainable 10 years ago probably wasn't. What we think is now won't be. It's a journey.
Let's bring ourselves back round to where we began with cooling. So was there anything else to add to that conversation?
Beyond the reiterating the size of the glass areas to begin with, which is a massive factor, obviously. The other one is, so we design all the buildings so you can naturally ventilate them. So, the ability to open the windows. So, unsurprisingly, there's a lot of tilt-turn windows. When they're turned, that's a big hole in the wall. That's incredibly useful. The key thing, and this is, I guess, a challenge possibly more here than it is in the UK right now, but is going to change, is the default assumption with natural ventilation is that the outdoor air is desirable, or more desirable than the indoor air. So aside from bushfires and pollution from vehicles outside, there's also that, is it actually cool? The answer here is not always. And every now and again, we will have a heat wave run. So heat waves of 40 plus degrees in the day aren't great. Like, nobody particularly loves that. But the key defining factor is becoming what is the overnight temperature. And it is not uncommon, in Sydney at least, for those temperatures to not go below 28 overnight. And therefore, while 28 is better than 40, it's still outside of almost every human's comfort zone. And therefore, the ability to naturally ventilate a building is really important. We're never going to go away from the ability to do it, but you rapidly realise that you do need some form of mechanical cooling, because there are moments in the year, and increasingly so, where it just isn't going to be particularly helpful.
And finally, are there any tips that you have for anyone starting house projects? Anything additional that we haven't already mentioned that might be helpful on their journey?
So many things.
Well, keep going.
I ask lots of questions of people who should know decent answers, and if you don't understand the answer, ask the same person again, and if it still doesn't make sense, ask someone else. Knowing as much as you can before you start is the key to any one of these projects. Obviously, the more professionals you surround yourself by, competent professionals, the easier that's going to be. They will have seen and done stuff before, but it is significantly cheaper and easier and less stressful to learn from other people's mistakes. I would recommend leveraging them as much as possible. You will make some of your own. Everyone does. Realise them as quickly as you can. Learn, move on. Try not to do it twice. Making the same mistake multiple times isn't a good sign.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for chatting to me today. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/346. You can review the main points on our summary. We always give you one of those. There are photos to take a look at as well. We talked about a couple of projects. And if you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can either do that within the show notes, but you've got to head down to the bottom, or on social media, we'll give you links. And of course, we'll link you to Envirotecture. houseplanninghelp.com/346. What can you do in a world that is reaching all the planetary boundaries? What can you do in the face of the climate emergency? What can you do to be more in sync with the planet? They're all big questions. They've been addressed by other people many times. Yeah, I get that. And we actually have answers. They're not often answers we want to hear, perhaps. Maybe they try and boil it down to some key actions that we can take, which are stop eating meat, stop flying. Yeah, of course. My favourite food growing up was steak. Even today, maybe my favourite food is still bacon, not that I eat it that much. And then there's travel. That has been a passion of my life as well, meeting people in different cultures. And I'm lucky to have had several adventures. So two things which, on the face of it, really, really difficult to address. However, I've tried. Certainly, I am eating a lot more vegetarian meals than I ever used to. And what's interesting is you develop a taste for it and perhaps want it more. I've also grumbled every time we've booked a flight, thinking that I know I shouldn't be doing this, but where's the balance? You also have some really good times when you head abroad. And yeah, so what do we do in this predicament? So I've just spent 6 weeks in Australia. Fantastic trip. Great way to start the year. My parents were out there. My brother lives there. My other brother was out with his wife. And I thought, I can't miss this, but also this could be the perfect opportunity to just draw a line under long distance travel. Hopefully it's not the end of my adventures. I'll just have to get a bit more creative. So I'm saying no to long haul flights and seeing where that leads me. The other thing is you don't realise all the impacts. I might, if it weren't for having a family, give up flying altogether. But I know that that's one of my wife's favourite things, is going on a summer holiday. So I'll continue to do the odd short haul flight for the family, for those memories. And we'll see what happens giving up long haul flying. And in that conversation that we just had with Andy, I thought lovely that comment about how we're on this journey, aren't we, with sustainability. And hopefully it's when you look back that you realise how far you've come. Next time, we continue my interviews from Australia. Met some lovely people. Amelia Lee from Undercover Architect. You may know her already. If not, get subscribing to her podcast too. So much good stuff. So many tips next time. Thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.